All right. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody. Hello, group. Um, yeah, Steve's right. I mean, just a quick story. I can remember back in early 90s, holed up in some hotel room with Steve and I think Linda and Bill at Follett and Victoria and some of the Labbies, Kelly and Robin Walser, you know, plotting the takeover of psychology in the field. And it's amazing now that we've actually gotten to the point where it looks like it's starting to happen. We're starting to get some movement and change, which is neat. So what I'm going to what I'd like to do here, given this is a lab meeting, is I want to share some data with you, some new data that we have looking at the effectiveness of ACT for anxiety disorders. So that sound like something everybody be interested in seeing? So what I'm going to do here, hopefully, is I'm going to switch over to PowerPoint for a bit, and then if there are questions, I'll pop out of it, and if it makes sense, and we can talk live through the video. So let's see if I can get this to work. Can everybody see that? Can you all see that? Hey, Steve, did you see that come up on the screen? Oh, you do? Okay, I can't hear you when. Yes. Okay. Okay, sounds good. Okay, what my students and I have been up to for past year or so is really taking ACT out into the field, out into the trenches, but without a therapist. And so what I want to introduce you to a little bit is some of this work in the context of self-help and reaching a significant portion of the population that's suffering from anxiety disorders. Before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge that Garrigan Eifert and I have been collaborating, doing quite a bit of this work together. You'll see Garrig on the right and me offering him a host at the recent AABCT meeting, a pre-conference cocktail party. But Garrig and I have been collaborating for quite a bit, and it's really been amazing to me to see sort of the data and some of the fruits of this collaboration kind of panning out, not just with us, I guess, but also collaborations with the rest of the ACT community. So it's been really exciting in that respect. But sometimes miraculous things happen, like at ABCT, as I was passing this to Garrig, something odd appeared on the host, and I thought it'd be interesting just to share it with you. And you'll see that that interesting things do happen, and you have Steve's picture. And Steve actually has been central to this work and inspiring this work that I'm about to share with you. So thanks, Steve, and thanks for all the hard work you've done. I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about anxiety. Just about everybody on this planet has felt it, or something that we call anxiety and fear. And often when I'm working with people who are suffering from anxiety problems, or even thinking about my own anxieties, and working with people in workshops, I describe it something like having a big hungry lion in the room, and sort of what we would do under those circumstances. And except in the modern world, we really don't face those lions, but it's like, anxiety can be like living with a hungry lion. And it follows us wherever we go. We have our history, we have that history capacity with us. And behavior analysts and even some of the traditional CBTers will talk about this as a problem of behavior under aversive control. And I know Kelly's written and talked quite a bit about this. But if you look closely at what happens here is that when anxiety and fear show up, we tend to narrow, and other options are not available to us, other behavioral options. So we narrow, we harden, at least psychologically and emotionally. The world shuts in on us, and we focus on our own needs and our own self-preservation. And in the process, the world washes away. Other things that are important and meaningful to us disappear. And many people think that's a problem. And I say, well, sort of. I mean, under strong aversive emotions, this could be perfectly helpful. If there was an actual lion, you'd want to bracket all your attention on it and do what you can to get away. But with anxiety disorders, it's a little bit different. In every single case, it's not just the anxiety and fear and intensity and frequency of it and having it connected with odd things like, touching a doorknob or flying in a plane or whatnot. It's actually, in every case, even with PTSD, you will see a change in behavior about and through the anxiety. So people work very hard to not think what they think or remember. They work very hard not to feel what they feel. And they work very hard to be something other than they are. And this set of behaviors creates even bigger problems, as we know. And you'll see this too when people come into therapy for anxiety complaints. They've tried a number of things. Here are some of them. This is just a sampling of the thousands of self-help offerings for anxiety. And many of these have not undergone rigorous testing. They're out there. And many clients, people who are suffering with anxiety, also turn to medications. And frequently, you'll see that too with the self-help data I'm about to present. Many of the people that were in the trial were taking some form of medication. So they're trying many different things, and including classic avoidance, which, it's been talked about as a hallmark of anxiety problems, this idea that, that people have avoidance disorders or avoidance phobias, I guess as you call it, basically running from just about anything that would trigger illicit, unpleasant thoughts and feelings. Another way to look at this is also in terms of what we do with our thoughts and our feelings and our history, given the circumstances. And sometimes it leads to struggle, and the struggle is not with things outside of us. It's the struggle is within. It's with our history. It's with our thoughts. And this general idea of struggling falls under that category of emotion regulation that you'll hear about if you read and dig into the current work in emotion science. It's basically struggling with our history, trying to make it go away, trying to minimize it, minimize the intensity, the frequency, the duration. And in ACT, we talk about this struggle as partly due to experiential avoidance. But you've also seen this talked about in the ACT model. I'm sure Steve has covered it in terms of the hexaflex model of psychopathology, where we have experiential avoidance as a part, cognitive fusion, attachment to the self, inaction, impulsivity, avoiding persistence, lack of values clarity, which should make sense that if your focus is on the lion between your ears and in your heart, you really lose sight of what matters to you in your life, and then living in the past or the future. And all of this creates that narrowness, just like you would see if a lion was in the room and you were told that 2 of you are going to be eaten. So get ready. And what would you do? And I've done that exercise in workshops. It's amazing. People climb over tables, climb over each other to get out of the room. And that's what we can do with our painful history as well. So it's this narrowness, this psychological inflexibility, and you see this over and over again, people who come in suffering with anxiety disorders. Now, stepping back a bit, looking at the scope of this problem, if you look closely, we know from, as long as we've been on this planet, that anxiety is perfectly healthy and adaptive. It's not something to get rid of. In fact, we have that capacity to feel anxiety and fear because it's helped us survive and it's helped us be safe and get away from harm and real threat and danger. And just about every single person on this planet will feel what we call anxiety and fear at some point in their lives, and often many times. But here's what we also know, that 40 million adults in the US in a year will suffer about their anxiety. And we also know this, that very few seek treatment. I mean, estimates now is like up to a quarter of the people who are suffering out there actually go in and seek help. And when they do, it tends to be inadequate. I mean, many people will go to primary care physicians as a first line, and there the treatment tends to be suboptimal. They're just not prepared to handle and deal with people who are suffering with anxiety problems in an appropriate way, in an evidence-based way. And we also know that from epidemiological surveys that less than 30% of those that do seek treatment actually get appropriate care, which is alarming. And it's also more alarming when you look at the costs associated with anxiety. It's been estimated that we spend about $273 billion just for untreated mental illness alone, with anxiety and mood disorders ranking up there at the top. And about $70 billion of that actually goes to direct care services. The rest of it goes to lost productivity, unneeded medical visits, unneeded medication prescriptions, and on, disability, lost time, damage to relationships, damage to social life, and we can keep adding on to that. And so the idea here is that the costs people typically think of financially, but the costs are also personal and deeply personal to many people, and really has to do with costing them the life they want to lead. We also know that we don't have enough therapists to handle the burden of people suffering with anxiety disorders. I mean, this has come up again and again that, I remember being in grad school thinking, gee, everybody is like me, everybody's kind of thinking with a scientific mindset and using best practice, evidence-based practices, and trying to be empirical and conscious and in touch with the literatures they treat. And the reality is it just isn't so. The therapists that are out there treating, many of them have no idea how to use evidence-based interventions, cognitive behavioral. And just now people are starting to really get a sense of what ACT is or other mindfulness-based approaches. But we don't have enough therapists that can actually do the job. And we know that therapy is costly. It takes a huge amount of energy, financial, to come and see a therapist to get help. So we have to reach the suffrages out there in a way that maybe is cost effective, but also impactful in a broad sense and hopefully durable. So this kind of takes us to the work in ACT, and from the initial beginnings in theory and philosophy, and now into randomized trials. We have manuals in the form of self-help books. And you need those to evaluate an intervention, or even to test it, you have to have some kind of manual. So there is a growth in the development of ACT self-help manuals, self-help workbooks. And this is just a partial listing. And in all, across the board, at least with most of these self-help books, the idea is to promote the other side of the hexaflex, the sort of the side of the hexaflex that focuses on promoting psychological flexibility. And our workbook for anxiety disorders, the Mindfulness and Acceptance workbook, does that, or attempts to do this as well, is to get most of these processes into the book in a way that we thought or think would be helpful to people. So what I want to do here is introduce you to the data we have from a randomized clinical trial that we are just wrapping up, looking at the Mindfulness and Acceptance workbook for anxiety. Now, this was a pure self-help trial, and I think it's important to emphasize that many of the existing bibliotherapy and self-help trials, if you look closely, most of them are therapist guided or have some kind of therapist contact. There are very few of them that simply do what we did, which is randomize people to get a book or not. Now, it's not the ideal match to the real world where somebody might go on Amazon or go to Barnes & Noble and just grab a book. That kind of study is hard to do. So there may be some difference in the population that would enroll in a study like this versus go to a bookstore to grab the book. But nonetheless, this trial is one where the therapist is out of the equation. There's no therapist contact involved with this trial. And what we did was we set up a website to recruit people from all over the world. actforanxiety.com is where we hosted it. And we ended up with about 503 people. And we ended up with 503 eligible people within the span of about 4 months, which is actually remarkable. We didn't think it would do as well as it did, and the fact that we had so many people is just extraordinary to us. And I'll get back to that in a bit in terms of impact. And what happened was once people were screened at the study site, they were randomized to get the workbook right away or to a waitlist control. And when they got the workbook, they were asked to use it and work with it at their own pace within a 12-week window. And then what we did was we crossed the waitlist over to use the workbook after the 12 weeks. And we continued to follow the people who started with the workbook, and we followed them up to 6 months out. So we followed them at 3 and 6 months. Now, to be eligible for the study, you had to be at least 18, you'll see that, have access to a computer or internet. And there, That was mainly for the purpose of doing the larger self-assessments that we had pre, post, and at the follow-ups. They had to be able to read and write English at the 8th grade level. We also asked them if they had any prior exposure to ACT or any ACT work or books, and if they did, they were excluded. And I think one of the more key questions here was this one. We asked them if they viewed anxiety and fear as a significant life problem for them. So really we're looking at their own perceptions of their emotions and asking them whether they saw that as a problem, if they saw that as getting in the way of their lives. And it turns out that was probably one of the more impactful questions of the screen. So people had to meet eligibility. Here's just a shot of the website that we set up. And you'll see that we also had an online forum for participants. There was a private forum that they could use to support one another. And we found that that was underutilized. We thought that more people would use it, but I think that if you look closely at the self-help forums on the web, you'll find that many of these people are connected to several other forums for support and whatnot. So there were some people who used it, but not many. Now, I want to just give some kudos to my student, Sean Sheppard, who did a lot of the heavy lifting with this project. You'll see him with the halo around his head. He couldn't be here today, but he really drove this project in it. And I also should just point out that, and Steve probably knows this, and anybody else who's doing this work, is that doing a study like this is incredibly demanding if you try to do it right. And we didn't have a grant. We didn't have all the other resources available, paid staff and so on to do it. So Sean put many hours into the wee hours of the morning, actually, on several occasions, just working on this project, tracking people through. So here's what we ended up with. We had participants from 25 countries around the world, mostly from the US and Canada and Australia, as you might expect. And if you look again at the demographics, the majority were female, but that's what you would expect based on what we know about people suffering with anxiety problems, at least those that seek treatment. Majority tend to be female. The majority of the sample reported that they had sought out psychotherapy before, and about half said they were actively in psychotherapy. And about half also said they were currently taking a medication for an anxiety or mood disorder. So, and what's interesting about this is when we looked at, were there any differences between the wait list and the control group, turns out that about half in the wait list were in psychotherapy and or taking medications, and about half in the treatment group. That will be important when you look at the response of the wait list during the wait list period before they actually got the book. So the groups didn't differ on any of the key demographics or these variables here. We also asked them about their previous diagnostic history. So the majority of the sample said they'd gotten some previous psychiatric diagnosis, and about 72% said that it was an anxiety disorder. And if you look at the distribution here, it's more or less what you would expect based on epidemiological studies in terms of the rates. The other category included people who said they had been told they have ADHD, or maybe they have somebody told they had bipolar disorder, or they had some type of comorbid diagnosis. But very few, about a little over 5%, said that they'd never been diagnosed. So one of the things here that's important as well, we couldn't verify the diagnosis, but what we wanted to know is what kind of sample we're dealing with. And from the previous data about psychotherapy medication use combined with this, it was suggesting to us that, we're not dealing with the worried well, probably, but we weren't sure until we saw the time 1 assessment data. So let's look at what we're finding. Now, these are new data. We have all the way up through 3 and 6 month follow-up. I know Steve has seen the earlier data, but this is the new stuff. And what I'm going to walk you through here, if you can have a look, is first orient you to the x-axis, because that's going to be similar throughout. And we literally just put this together past couple days, so we have to tweak the figures a bit to make them clearer. But what you see here is the pre-treatment assessment. Everybody got that. And then you see the post-treatment. That's after 12 weeks. and then 3-month and 6-month follow-up. So the x-axis is anchored to this active treatment group. The 6-month follow-up for the wait list is really their 3-month, okay? So what I want to orient you to here first is the Beck Anxiety Inventory scores. And you could see at the pre-assessment, based on the norms and cut scores, that the groups were equivalent and in the severe range based on Beck's established norms. You notice over the 12 weeks, those that got the workbook showed significant reduction in anxiety based on Beck's score, cutoffs and score, and the wait list is still in the severe range after 12 weeks. It's good for a study, not so good for the people in the study. But I think this is important. This is the initial treatment response effect, and this was a medium to large effect size post-treatment. And then what you see is the crossover here. So the treatment group is now going into wait list, or basically return to baseline, if you will, or follow-up below. And the wait list is now working with the book here. And now the workbook is going out to 6 months. And here's the 3-month follow-up for the wait list. And what you see basically is that those that got the workbook initially have come down from the severe range into the mild range by 6 months, and the waitlist folks are on their way. And these are all significant. The interactions are significant as well. Now, I want to mention one other thing. In the workbook, we don't mention anything about anxiety going down as a goal. We don't promise it. We don't tell people to expect it. Essentially, what we do is take an open stance. And the idea being that we don't know what's going to happen to your anxiety as you learn a different relationship with it. It may go up, it may go down, it may morph and change. So we leave that wide open. And yet, people report significant reductions in anxiety without targeting it directly. We also looked at the number of people who remained in the severe anxiety range at pre, post, and at the follow-ups. And you can see basically significant and stable reduction in the number of people who reported still being in the severe range out to 6 months. So this is quite a big drop from 63% to about 25% of the group. So almost the majority down to about a quarter. We also looked at the Bdi and depression. And again, the book does not deal with depression directly, but if you've followed ACT up to this point with Steve and in the class, you know that ACT targets a series of processes that also show up with problems associated with mood and depression, including anger for that matter. So again, orienting you to this slide, you'll see here's the wait list in the first 12 weeks. Here's the active treatment group. Okay, and this was a large effect size. And you notice that the active treatment folks went from moderate to severe anxiety down to mild to moderate anxiety in 12 weeks, but not the wait list folks. And then at the cross, now they were using the workbook, they're showing significant reduction in their depression. And meanwhile, those that are now going into follow-up with the workbook are maintaining their gains and stable. And actually, the waitlist folks at 3-month follow-up actually meet them. And these interactions are also significant. So even though the book doesn't target depression, we know that depression and mood disorders co-occur with anxiety. So it's kind of neat to actually see this kind of a bump with depression. And we looked at the number or percent of people reporting severe depression across time. And again, you see a similar pattern. About 37.6% of the pretreatment group reported severe depression, and then it drops significantly at post-treatment in the 3-month and 6-month follow-up. We also looked at worry using the Penn State Worry Questionnaire. So again, one of the things we were trying to do is address some of the traditional criticisms of ACT work with the trials. Like, you don't have state-of-the-art measures in there. If you do, they're limited, or you're not using the right ones, blah, blah, blah. So in addition to the Beck measures, we also have the Penn State Worry Questionnaire, which is the gold standard for assessing so-called pathological worry. And this line indicates the clinical cutoff for those who are diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. So you can see at time 1, both groups are right up there at that cutoff. Workbook folks show significant improvement initially, but not the wait list. This is a medium to large effect size post-treatment. And then when you cross, those with the wait list show significant reduction in worry, and those who continue to follow at 3 and 6 months with the workbook maintain their gains, even though we don't say that your worry is going to go down in the book. We also looked at anxiety sensitivity. So you can see the cutoffs for people with panic disorder with moderate to severe agoraphobia. Here's the cut for GAD. And here's the mean for non-clinical folks on the ASI. So again, both groups are starting in the severe range. Folks in the workbook show significant improvement over 12 weeks relative to waitlist. This is a medium to large effect size post. And then when the waitlist folks get the book, they show a significant drop in their fear of their fear. And they continue to show improvement out to 3 months. And the workbook folks continue to maintain their gains and improve at 3 and 6. Similar pattern with social anxiety based on the fear questionnaire. Not targeted directly. We focused on the Hexaflex ACT processes throughout. But again, workbook significant reduction relative to waitlist up to post-treatment. It's a medium effect size. And then when the waitlist folks got the book, they show a reduction and they continue out and actually meet, which is neat, out to 6 months or 3 months for the waitlist. Now, the other key part of the study is we were interested in process. So we tried to assess what we thought were relevant process variables in this trial. This is turning out to be important. It's important ACT work because ACT is built on a model, as you know. It's not just a technology. And the processes were built into the workbook, and they're built into most ACT work. So the first one we looked at here was mindfulness. This is the mindfulness, attention, and awareness scale. It really sort of measures a pure attentional facet of mindfulness. But what you'll see again, so higher scores are better, just to orient you to this. So what you'll see again is that relative to waitlist, the workbook showed significant improvements in mindfulness. There's a medium effect size of post-treatment. And then once the waitlist got the book, they show a significant improvement in mindfulness. And what's really neat too is that the active treatment arm continues to maintain their gains all the way out to 6 months. And the waitlist folks actually start to exceed them at their 3-month assessment. Then we looked at thought suppression using the White Bear suppression inventory. Again, the pattern is pretty much similar to what you've seen before. The norms here are a little difficult to pinpoint, but basically some published work says that anything about 53 and below is considered sort of the normal range scores on the White Bear suppression inventory. So you can see that both groups are elevated in their tendency to suppress their thoughts prior to the intervention. The workbook folks show a significant reduction relative to the wait list, and this is a medium effect size post-treatment. And then when the wait list gets the book, they show a reduction, and the active treatment group maintains. And in fact, they exceed the treatment group out to their 3-month assessment there. So we're addressing the tendency to suppress thoughts, to be more mindful. And then this one here is fusion. And this is the Believability of Anxious Feelings and Thoughts questionnaire. This is a measure that Garrick and I developed as part of the UCLA trial. They were looking for some kind of measure of fusion and diffusion. And at the time, there weren't any real established measures. Most studies and researchers had developed measures of fusion and diffusion to fit the purposes of their study. So we did more or less the same thing. We've since almost ready to wrap up 2 psychometric studies now where we had another look at the 30-item BAFT, and we've reduced it down to now 16 items that seem to perform really well in a non-clinical and clinical sample. So that's what I'm reporting here now. So what you have here again is higher scores mean more fusion with thoughts, buying into your thoughts. And so both groups are equivalent at time 1 assessment. Workbook shows significant reduction in their fusion with their thoughts and buying into them relative to the waitlist. And that is what I call an uber large effect. Cohen doesn't use that term, but I thought it'd be fun. And then when you cross again, the waitlist then now shows more diffusion when they're using the book, and they continue to improve, and the active treatment condition maintains their gains out to 6 months. So that is pretty cool. So it's another process variable. We also looked at psychological flexibility using the short version of the AAQ, the original AAQ. So again, both groups started in the same spot. The active treatment group showed improvements or more flexibility in the time they were using the workbook relative to the waitlist. And then when the waitlist got it, they showed more of a bump, an improvement in psychological flexibility. And those, again, continued out and actually met at the far out follow-up. And this was a large effect size as well. So the thing that's neat about this is we're starting to show a pattern of things move when you use the book, but not before. Now also keep in mind that half of the people in the waitlist group are in psychotherapy or taking medications for an anxiety or mood-related problem. And the same is true of the treatment group. So I thought this was a little discouraging given that half of the people here are getting something. We don't know if they're getting adequate care, but they are getting something. I'd expect that that would actually work against us showing some effects, but apparently not. And then self-compassion. This is central to ACT work, and it's actually something that I'm very interested in. This notion of opening up to your own history and meeting it with a kinder, gentler response, getting with your suffering and the suffering of others, and opening up to that. So Steve's talked about this quite a bit. We assessed it using Kristen Neff's self-compassion scale, and we actually have sections in the workbook that specifically address growing and developing skills and self-compassion. So what you see here again is that based on the norms that Neff provides, both groups started in the low domain for self-compassion, and the waitlist group stayed there over the 12 weeks, while the active treatment group showed significant increases in self-compassion. This was a very large effect size. And then when the waitlist group got the book, they show an increase, and both of them continue to trend toward increasing self-compassion. So again, this is one of those targets that we address in the workbook. And lastly here was quality of life. We struggled with how to assess this. We don't have a pure measure of valued action, but we do use Frisch's quality of life inventory, which assesses satisfaction and importance across several different life domains. So this is just the total score that we looked at. Now, both groups started below 0, which indicates a relatively poor quality of life. The workbook folks who got the workbook first showed significant increase relative to waitlist. It was actually showing a trend toward deterioration until they got the book, and they start to improve. And the active treatment group, the active arm, the initial arm, continued to maintain their gains out to 6 months, and at 3 months, the waitlist folks are continuing to improve. This was a medium to large effect size. Now, we asked people a number of questions after the treatment. Majority of people said they reported moderate to significant benefit using the workbook. Interestingly, the average amount of time that people said they spent was with the book per week was around 4 hours, which is significantly more than they'd probably spend with a therapist, which I thought was interesting. So maybe this is a more highly motivated group, more distressed group. 82% of the sample said they reported moderate to significant improvement in their lives over the 12 weeks. A little over half said they were moderately to fully unstuck and engaged in their lives after the intervention. But here's the downside, is that with this type of trial, we really had no incentives for doing the large assessments pre, post, and at the follow-ups. The only real incentive was to get a book or not. So we have a high attrition rate with this study. So looking at just pre to post treatment, we lost 45% of the active treatment arm during that time. So we started with 250, we lost about 45% of them in that window. We only lost 20% of the waitlist folks because they didn't get the workbook until after the time 2 assessment, so it's kind of interesting when you look at when we cross. When we cross, we lose about 66% of the waitlist folks once they get the book. So again, we're hoping to improve on this. I think incentives would help, but in the same token, maybe this is how it is. Maybe this is what you get when you take an intervention and do a real-world evaluation of it without all of the phone calls and the check-ins and contacts with therapists and study staff to keep people on task. Now, one of the other things we did with the data is we looked at mediators and mechanisms of action. And one of the things we're interested in is, do any of those ACT processes we assessed mediate outcome? So I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly, but there's a lot of interest now in not just does treatment work, but how or why our treatments work. And there's a lot of emphasis on looking at mechanisms and processes. Therapists out in the field often think in terms of process, clinical process, and it's just now that the psychotherapy community is starting to come around and look at this more closely, at least within CBT. And there are a lot of good reasons for this. One is to reduce the burden and the just unwieldy number of techniques and technologies that are out there, and down to a core set that address certain key processes that seem to maintain suffering and also help alleviate suffering. This also can provide connections between treatment and various outcomes. So we know, like, if we move this process, we can move this outcome, which would be neat, again, to be able to disseminate that kind of information. It can also help us optimize treatments, that we focus our treatments on a core set of processes. And actually, this is what ACT is really about. You can have an infinite number of technologies built around a small set of processes, which are, I think it's more easy to disseminate the intervention that way. It allows for innovation and creativity. It points to targets for change. Anything that can address the process may be helpful. And it's just fun work, too. This is just kind of interesting work to do. Now, one way to get at mechanism and process to use a traditional randomized clinical trial or some kind of experimental design, and there's another way to do this with statistical mediation. So basically, the idea of mediation is pretty simple. It's based on regression. This X is the independent variable, Y is the dependent variable, and C is the direct path between the independent variable and the dependent variable. When you're looking at mediation down below, you're looking at what happens to this direct path when you account for the mediator. So does the effect of X on Y operate through the mediator? So that's what C prime really stands for, is what happens to this path when the mediator is accounted for. Does it grow in strength, or does it actually fall out to be non-significant, which would be closer to full mediation? Now, there have been recent work looking at multiple mediation, and this is what we did with the data that I just presented to you. So we're looking at the effect of the independent variable, which is treatment group, on certain outcomes, accounting for not just one mediator at a time, but several. So we put several of the processes in at once to see how they impact the outcome. So let me just show you this visually. So in this slide, what we have here is group, which is active treatment or the wait list at, and looking at pre to post data. And initially we looked at, does treatment group predict change in anxiety post-treatment? And as you'd expect, it does when you just look at it alone. You get the workbook, you're going to get a different change in anxiety than if you don't get it. And so that makes perfect sense. But what happens when you account for the processes that we expect to change and act? Does this relation still hold up? So we looked at the AAQ, psychological flexibility, mindfulness, self-compassion, thought suppression, and diffusion or fusion. And when you account for these variables, the relation between treatment group and anxiety completely falls out. It's not significant anymore. And so the effect of treatment group depends on the change in these processes to get the outcome. And more specifically, we looked at what processes here need to change for anxiety. And the ones that stand out as significant based on the confidence intervals turn out to be changes in thought suppression. So the more likely it is that you let go of struggling with and suppressing your thoughts, and diffusion. More diffused you are, the more of a change you get post-treatment in anxiety. And then we looked at Beck depression the same way. As you'd expect, treatment group predicts changes in depression. That's what you see here by the 9.12. But when you account for the process mediators, this relation, this direct path, falls out to non-significant. So group affects depression through changes in these processes. And specifically, which I think is really cool, based on talks and I've heard Steve give and others give, and some of Kirk's work and Bob's work, is that when you move psychological flexibility, when you increase self-compassion, when you reduce thought suppression and create a more diffused stance, you get movement in depression. But interestingly, not mindfulness, at least as assessed by the mass. It's not just about being more awake and aware with your attention. You need these other pieces in there, which I think is kind of neat. So this points to targets for change. And the last one here is quality of life. So again, if you just look at treatment group predicting quality of life, you see that it does predict quality of life. But as soon as you account for the process mediators, this direct path washes out and becomes not significant. So the effect of intervention, a wait list, depends on changes in these 5 processes. And specifically, and I think this is also kind of cool, improving your quality of life depends on a more flexible, self-compassionate, and more diffused stance. Not so much on being mindful the way the mass operationalizes it, or not just not suppressing your thoughts as much. It's actually more diffused, more compassionate, and more flexible you are, the more likely it is that your quality of life will improve. Now, these analyses, I just want to point out too, were all run controlling for time 1 scores. So we accounted for that as well. So what we see here with the mediation is that the set of 5 ACT-relevant processes that we assessed, and we're open to the possibility that we missed a bunch, and there are others that could substitute here just as well. Maybe better measures will come online. Mediated the relations between group or treatment group and anxiety, depression, and quality of life. Believability and diffusion was the only consistent mediator for all 3 outcomes. And mindfulness, as I said, really didn't carry much of a punch. Now, a number of you have been asking, I know in your questions, okay, so you did the randomized trial, waitlist control trial, showing that acts better than nothing or whatever people are doing anyways. And usually you're more likely to get large effect sizes with a waitlist control trial. But what about ACT compared to a traditional CBT book? And this is one of the questions I'm hearing over and over again when I go to ABCT meetings, and you see it with the critics of this work, is that you need to start pitting ACT against the gold standard. And in the behavior therapy community, it emerged out of treatment of anxiety disorders. So what we wanted to do here was, again, without a big grant, relying on the goodwill and generosity of Matt McKay at New Harbinger and others, is to compare the workbook directly to a cognitive behavioral workbook for anxiety. So that's exactly what we did. The Cognitive Behavioral Workbook for Anxiety is a newer book. It's a melding of REBT with traditional cognitive therapy, and then there's exposure work in there as well, some cognitive restructuring, but it's got a heavy dose of REBT. So this trial is still ongoing. We're still looking at the follow-ups, but I have preliminary data to share. So just like the previous trial, we recruited people from actforanxiety.com. Again, within the span of about 3 months, we had about 200 participants enrolled and eligible. They were randomized to ACT or CBT books. So again, no therapist allegiance factors involved with this. Here's a book, here's a book. We randomized them. They had 12 weeks to work with the book they were given. And then we informed them that we'd be following them at 3 and 6 months. So we don't have the 3 and 6 month yet. We just have the pre to post treatment. The same eligibility as before. We also asked, had used the Cognitive Behavioral Workbook before, and if you had or had read it or had it in your possession, they were ineligible for the study. In this study, the key player here is Amanda Russo, and she's got a halo around her head. In case you guys are wondering, the White Pine Lodge is the place my lab does a retreat together every fall. So she's the one who's taken the lead with this study. So let me just share some of the data quickly so we can get to some questions. Again, the majority of participants were from US, Canada, and Australia. Again, we saw about the same distribution, males to females. The majority were female, most were Caucasian. Again, about 39% said they were actively in psychotherapy. About 43% said they were currently taking medications for anxiety or mood disorder. And the proportions of people who reported being in psychotherapy and or on medications did not differ between the ACT and CBT group. And we have a much smaller sample size here to deal with at this point. The time to data are still rolling in, fortunately. There's still people who are coming around to complete that. So we're not done collecting those data yet. So what we're dealing with is about 33 people from the ACT group and about 28 from the CBT group. And there were no differences on the key time one assessment measures. Like before, most of the people are reporting some kind of previous psychiatric diagnosis, and the majority are saying it's some kind of anxiety disorder. So again, you can see major depression, GAD, right down the line. The pattern's very similar to what we saw before. We had a number of people in this study that just didn't indicate having been given a diagnosis or not. I'm not sure what to make of that. On the one hand, there may be a problem. On the other hand, I'm thinking that it's okay. Our goal was not to reach people who are already into full-blown suffering. I'd much rather be able to reach people who are having difficulty before they get to the point, the critical point where their lives are imploding around them. So let's take a look at what we're finding. So again, the Beck Anxiety Inventory, you can see pre to post. What's happening here is basically the ACT group is in the green and the CBT is in the orange. So regardless of the book, basically both yield significant reductions in anxiety. This is a small effect post-treatment, but a large effect for time, obviously. So, and they're going from the severe down the moderate range and trending to the mild. So it'll be interesting to look at what happens with the follow-up data. But again, we don't target this directly. The CBT book does. And the neat thing is they're performing about the same. When you look at depression with the BDI, again, like the first study, most people are starting in the moderate to severe range, and both books are producing reductions in anxiety. However, there's a significant interaction. So the ACT book is actually, depression. So the ACT book is actually producing steeper drop in depression, even though we don't address it directly, compared to the CBT group. And this is a medium effect size post-treatment. We also looked at the Penn State Worry Questionnaire. So again, both groups, ACT and CBT, are starting in the elevated range relative to norms for GAD sufferers pre-treatment. Both show significant reductions in worry, although the ACT group appears to be showing a more steeper drop, again, even though we don't address changing worry directly in the book. And this is a medium effect size post-treatment, but only a significant time effect. So here's fear of fear, the fear of your own emotions. Again, both groups start in the severe range to start with. Both show significant reductions, but there's an interaction here. So the ACT group is actually showing greater improvements in this tendency to be afraid of your own fear relative to the CBT book, and there's a medium effect size post-treatment for that. They're actually approaching, if you notice, the mean for non-clinical samples, which I think is really cool. Now, unlike the first study, we didn't assess PTSD directly. This time we did, kind of got smart about it. So we put the PTSD checklist, civilian version, into the battery. Up here is the cutoff for people who are given the diagnosis of PTSD. So you can see that both groups are very close to that cutoff. Both groups show reductions over time. However, the ACT group shows much more significant reduction in PTSD severity relative to the CBT book over the 12 weeks, and they're actually approaching the mean for those who report no PTSD. And this is a medium effect size post-treatment. So I was pretty stoked about that. We're going to go and look at the number of people who report a PTSD diagnosis, and I imagine some of this will change a bit. We also looked at OCD using the PAUD inventory, Washington University scale. Now this is interesting. You look at this figure, again, we get a significant interaction, and we get a small to medium effect size post-treatment. But notice what's happening with OCD severity. OCD severity is actually increasing in the CBT group, pre to post, and decreasing in the ACT group, pre to post treatment. And again, we don't address OCD directly in this book. I think this is a little bit troubling for the traditional CBT model. And then we have process measures on board. So again, like before, we assessed mindfulness using the mass, and just like before, you get a significant bump in mindfulness for the ACT group relative to CBT. That interaction is significant, and this is a medium to large effect size post-treatment. So we address this. The Cognitive Behavioral Workbook does not address mindfulness at all. It doesn't teach it or promote it. Thought suppression, interestingly, decreased over time for both workbook conditions. So there was no significant interaction. The Cognitive Behavioral Workbook, you know, it's actually true of many of the CBT workbooks, so it probably deserves comment, but a number of them are starting to filter in talk that sounds very similar to ACT and similar to mindfulness-based traditions. Where in the CBT workbook, they're talking about kind of watching your thoughts, not, you know, the words of not struggling with them as much are starting to pop up in those books as well. So, but again, the neat thing is you get a reduction. It does look like the ACT group is showing a steeper decline, and if we get more people maybe in both conditions, maybe this will clean up a bit, but still a large effect size, approaching a large effect size post-treatment. So that was kind of neat. So reducing thought suppression. Diffusion, there was a significant interaction here, as you'd expect. So we address diffusion, the CBT book does not, and you can see that we produce this more precipitous decline or more diffuse stance over the treatment, the 12-week treatment period relative to the CBT book. And this is a medium effect size post-treatment. And here's the mean now for the non-clinical sample. So these folks are approaching that mean, and we'll have to see if they get there at the follow-ups. Again, with the AAQ measuring psychological flexibility, both groups start about the same place between the mean of a clinical sample and non-clinical sample. Both show improvements in flexibility. However, this interaction was significant, so the ACT group is showing a more precipitous improvement over the 12 weeks relative to the CBT book. I mean, in some ways, the CBT approach, traditional CBT, ought to improve some flexibility, even though they won't say that's what accounts for the change in outcome. But given the new skills and new things that people are learning in traditional CBT, you would think that people would be a little more flexible after the treatment. But nonetheless, another way to look at the AQ is it's reducing avoidance, and CBT clearly addresses avoidance. So both of them are producing reductions in avoidance and struggle. The ACT group is getting a bigger bump there. And then self-compassion. This is also kind of cool because the ACT workbook targets it directly, but not the CBT book. And in fact, the CBT book doesn't mention self-compassion at all. So they don't show any real significant increase, but the ACT group does. So the interaction is significant, and this is a medium effect size post-treatment. So it's in the direction of more self-compassion. We also included the metacognitions questionnaire. And metacognitions, and you may have talked about it in your class, are really thoughts about thoughts. This has become a popular construct in the CT community. People are finding ways, like with Wells' work, to interface that with third-generation approaches, and I think that's pretty cool. But we put it in there just to see what would happen with thoughts about thoughts with both books. And it turns out that, again, we get a significant interaction, that ACT reduces the unhelpful dominance of thinking about your thinking, more so compared to the CBT workbook. And this is a large effect post-treatment. So I thought that's neat. It's actually something we address in ACT. Some of you had questions, too, about control. You know, is control part of CBT is traditionally defined, or ACT? I don't like those distinctions personally between ACT and CBT. I agree with Steve, and I really loved his one-liner, we're all part of the same tribe. And I'm a Survivor fan, that reality TV show, and I certainly don't want to be voted off the island. So I think ACT is part of that tribe. And so one of the interesting questions, though, is what happens with ACT in terms of control? So the anxiety control questionnaire measures control over anxiety. And we don't address that directly. We don't teach people how to master and control their anxiety. What we do is give people another set of skills to learn a new relationship with their anxiety. So it could be paradoxically that by letting go of unhelpful struggle, you actually gain more control, which I think is what's going on. I'm not quite sure how to tease that out in a study. But here's what we find, is basically we get a significant time effect. So both workbooks produce significant increases in the sense of control over anxiety, and there's a small effect post-treatment. So no interaction here. And lastly, quality of life. So here, like the first study, we get a significant interaction. The ACT workbook produces a more rapid increase in quality of life relative to the CBT book. And this is a small to medium effect size post-treatment. Again, we're really kind of honed in on this one. I really would love to have a more objective measure of valued action, something that we can address. Maybe we can talk about that after this. So, I mean, pulling it all together, I'm really jazzed about this kind of work. I mean, Steve's doing it. Other people are starting to do it. It needs to be done. And the thing that gets me jazzed the most is the idea that we can reach hundreds and potentially thousands of people with an intervention that may be helpful and do it in a relatively short period of time. There's no way that we could have run both of these studies on the ground with face-to-face contact with live therapists week after week and be anywhere we are now. In fact, you know, the UCLA trial, the ACT and CBT trial that you read about, that study was going on for over 3 years. And I think they ended up with about 40 to 60 people or subjects after those 3 years and finishing up the follow-up. In the time that they were still working on that study, toward the tail end, we were able to collect the data that we did. So I'm humbled by the idea that we can actually reach out and make an impact with people. So I'm going to switch back to the video now, and hopefully we can chat and talk about this work and any other questions you have. So let me see if I can get back. Yeah, I got you. Let me get back to you. All right, there we go. Did that work? Oh, let's see. Oh yeah, let me unshare. There we go. Here. So that was ACT self-help on steroids. So getting through it all quickly. Okay, cool. Yeah, you're moving. Hi, Greg. That's kind of a cool question. I'm getting really pissed, getting ready to respond to your question. So let's start with the meds thing first. One of the things we didn't ask people about, and this is something that I'm just chomping at the bit to get into one of these studies, and maybe Steve's doing it, is the whole idea of medical cost or just cost offset in general. In the CBT ACT workbook study we have going on now, Amanda is asking people in the past 3 months, how many times did you visit your doctor? How many times did you visit the emergency room? How many times did you not show up to work because you were feeling anxious or depressed? So she's starting to tap that. Now, we didn't look at whether people discontinued their meds after any of these studies. Did you stop using them? We asked people to actually stabilize on them. So it's typically what's done in randomized trials is you don't want people to be messing with their medications while they're working with an intervention. But it is something to look at. But here's what we did look at, and I don't have the data to show you, but I can just describe it. I don't know if any of you are familiar with some of the new, the clinical trials like Dave's done with imipramine and panic, where you look at permutations of CBT alone, CBT placebo, imipramine alone, imipramine with CBT. So basically what he's found is that you get a good bump with CBT plus imipramine in the short term, but in the long term, you actually do better with just CBT alone than CBT combined with imipramine. And so we have those data kind of in a crude way in the data set. So what we did was just looked at the people in the first study who got the workbook, and we looked at them pre and post and then at 3 months. And we divided them up into people who just had the workbook, no psychotherapy or medications, and then people who had the workbook plus medication. Now the cool thing is, in the 12 weeks they were using the book, the people who had the medication in the workbook looked like they got kind of a steeper bump, improvements over the 12 weeks relative to people with workbook alone, but it wasn't statistically significant. So, we're talking about 50, 55 people here. So you get a time effect, basically. But it looks like there's a trend, medication might help. But here's the interesting thing. At the 3-month follow-up, if you had the workbook plus medication, you actually lose your gains, lose a significant number of them compared to workbook alone. People who had just the workbook continue to maintain their gains from post-treatment, and the people who had the medications and the workbook started to lose some of their gains. Now, they're not losing all of them. They started to go in the other direction. I don't know exactly what to make of that, but it kind of fits some of the bigger face-to-face randomized trial work that's going on now. So, neat. Oh, and about anger. Frank Gardner's done some of this work. One of the things that happens, and we've written about it too, with problem anger, you could conceptualize around those 6 processes in ACT of inflexibility. The avoidance, the fusion with thoughts. You see that with rumination, inaction or avoiding persistence. That people are doing things that they really don't want to do, and they're kind of pissed off about it, or other people are making choices for them, and lack of values clarity. Everything's about getting back, getting even, instead of doing what matters. I always kind of phrase it this way, that even though the ruckus energy inside may seem to overwhelm us, there's still a choice point, if we can find it, where we can open our arms and extend a hug instead of extending a clenched fist. So that, the anger behavior is what gets people in trouble with anger. It's not the feelings, it's not the thoughts. It's what people do with their mouth, hands, and feet. That's what gets people in jail. That's what creates ruin in relationships. That's what gets people fired. So, Frank Gardner's done some of this work, basically using not ACT, but something very close to ACT with people with problem anger. And Koki's, Matt McKay's students done this work too. But basically what happens when you teach them more acceptance and you assess this general predisposition to anger using Spielberger's trading anger measure, from pre to post, what happens is people start, with problem anger, people start the intervention reporting lower anger scores, right? So there's almost like they're suppressing it, but then after the intervention, their anger expression goes up, like they're feeling it, not expressing it behaviorally, but feeling it more. So they're actually feeling it more, but at post-treatment, they're actually acting on it less, which I think is really cool. So, and that makes sense from an ACT perspective, that if you open up to painful aspects of your history, you ought to feel more of what's there to be felt. Some of it's going to be good, some of it's not going to be so good. And so it says to me that they're actually contacting this stuff more, which is, exactly what you may do with traditional exposure-based therapies, and why when people go through exposure and they actually approach the things they dread, it feels bad if they do it openly and in a transparent way, fully approach without avoidance and safety. So they feel worse before they feel better. I know one of you had a question like that too, but when you see it in the ACT work as well. So hopefully that answered your question. Okay. All right. You got it.